Episode 17. Beef. It's practically never for dinner. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how much beef was actually eaten in the 17th century British colonies and what that beef tended to be. And I won't be able to help myself but be a little resentful at some details left out of the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing to know about 17th century beef in the British colonies. Most of the beef people are eating was from either very young animals or very old animals. People who were raising cows for sale as salt beef were an exception, but for everyone else, they ate beef either never or when the cow in question wasn't worth its feed. So the outline of cow life in the 17th century British Atlantic. At the very start, there were barely any cows. And as you know from the last episode, they were all pretty much allowed to run free. Typically, they were brought home each night using food bribery and some herding. This tended to result in missing and feral cows. Later, especially in the southern colonies, larger combined herds were walked about the range by early cowboys in the quasi-nomadic pastoral style familiar to both Europeans and Africans. And incidentally, the style of cow keeping that was being phased out right then in England due to the Enclosures Acts. 17th century cows were working cows. The three main jobs for cows at this point were to produce milk, provide muscle power, and to make more cows. Unlike modern cows where there are beef cows and dairy cows, fancy cows, grass-fed cows, cows were much more general. The New Spain cows in Central and South America were basically vaguely managed wild herds to be hunted, while the colonial cows were domestic cows to be worked. This is as specialized as it got. Yes, dairy traits had been under specific development for at least 600 years, and better-tempered cows were preferentially bred, but that was about as far as it went. There were certainly not the meat breeds and the dairy breeds the way they were developed in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So this is how the three main jobs of the British colonial cow worked out. The first job, provide milk, meant that heifers, or female cows, had to be impregnated and bear a calf annually to provide milk. Cows typically continue to produce milk for 8 to 10 months, and cow gestation lasts for around 9 months. Healthy dairy cows finish one milking cycle and go through a process of drying off and resting from milk production for about 2 to 3 months. They will then give birth to a new calf and start the cycle all over again. This means that to keep a cow in milk, they are usually bred 3 to 4 months after they have given birth to a calf. The heifers continued this cycle for several years until they were no longer good milk producers. In the tight food economy of the colonies, milk cows that could no longer produce milk were not worth feeding, and therefore became beef. I would just like to note here that while milk cows were definitely a subject in the Little House on the Prairie books, these details were entirely absent. The second cow job, muscle power, was filled by oxen, which are castrated male cattle. Intact male cattle, bulls, are very aggressive and tend not to grow as large as oxen. The biggest cows out there in the world, even today, are all steers or oxen, that is, castrated males. While modern cows are rarely allowed to age, when they do, it is not uncommon for them to be over 5 feet tall, or about 1.5 meters at the shoulder. Since working oxen regularly lived to a decade or more, even with the smaller breed sizes of the time, some would reach truly impressive sizes. And so with enormous muscle power and a calm disposition, they were useful for the typical ox jobs, like hauling carts and pulling plows. Again, the oxen would be employed in these muscle power pursuits until they were too old to be worth feeding, and then they would continue to be valuable as slaughtered beef. Often rather tough, stringy beef, but lots of it. And some other definitely beneficial products. Again, the Little House on the Prairie books. Laura Ingalls Wilder mentions Bright and Peat, but these essential details are missing. To be fair, animal husbandry was not the focus of her work. For the third job, making more cows, a few bulls were left intact or uncastrated. Cows generally are polygynous herd animals. That is, one bull defends a group of heifers. The people raising cows had no interest in lots of cow fights, so typically would keep only one bull at a time. And again, any particular bull would have a useful lifespan as a bull until it was time for him to also become meat. Unless a farmer was specifically raising cows to sell as barrels of salt beef on sugar plantations or to the Navy, merchant, fishing, and whaling ships, they had no need for extra cows. The forage for a single cow requires 2 to 5 acres or about 1 to 2 hectares each year, depending on the quality of forage. So adding an extra cow every year for the small family farmer who just wants a milk cow and a plowing ox or two, an extra cow every year was not going to work. So the annual calves necessary for milk production would typically be eaten as veal until it was time to raise one of them as a replacement milk cow or ox. Thus, most early colonial beef was a work cow before it was food. Unless it was a surplus calf, then it would become food immediately. So beef in the 17th century colonies was mostly eaten when it was very, very mature or just a few months old. Just for context, most modern beef cattle used for steaks and roasts in the U.S. today are typically 1 to 2 years old. Aged-out dairy cattle at 6 to 8 years old are more typically used as low-grade and commodity ground beef. That is currently in the process of changing, but we'll look into that in quite a while. As for those farmers who were raising cattle for the salt beef export trade, they were looking to do this on the cheap, for the highest profit possible. That meant that those cows were allowed to increase pretty willy-nilly and wander about rangelands that were unsuited for crop farming. As little effort as possible was put into them, and they were certainly not fed by the farmer. When it was time to sell the cattle, they would be collected and driven to a slaughter and salting facility, where they would be processed for sale. It also meant that while the cows were typically younger than the end-of-work life farm cows, they were neither particularly prime nor tender. These were cows that had been eating whatever forage they could find, were walking about quite a bit in search of their food, and likely were not getting quite enough food in the winter, when just about everyone was on short rations. How cows were butchered and the size of the pieces they were cut up into is pretty hard for the 21st century grocery shopper who buys beef one steak at a time to envision. But I'll try to give you a sense of scale. To learn this, I got to dive into the cool field of zooarchaeology. This includes that group of researchers I mentioned last episode that study the history of large farm animal husbandry. A 17th century cow ranged in size between 3 to 5 feet, or about 1 meter to 1.5 meters at the shoulder. Obviously, there would be a range of sizes and breeds, but I'll give you some approximate averages. Larger, older draft oxen could weigh up to 3,000 pounds, or equivalent to some modern cows, or about 1,350 kilos, while dairy cows were on the smaller side, somewhere around 900 pounds or 400 kilos. And the beef cattle of the southern colonies ranging between those two extremes. Calves would typically weigh in anywhere between 50 to 150 pounds. In the 17th century British colonies, there was no refrigeration beyond winter or the desultory cooling of a spring house. A spring house is going to come up repeatedly as we get into dairy products, so a quick description here. These were shacks or a small one-room house built over a spring bubbling up out of a rock or a spot in the ground. Because this water was coming up from the ground, it would be a very steady, cool temperature. In most of North America, this is usually between the low 40s in New England and the mid 60s in the Carolinas. That's a range of around 5°C to 15°C. In warm weather, this would create a cool space, both because water has a high heat capacity, that is, it absorbs a lot of heat energy from around it before rising in temperature, and because it was a spring, the cool water keeps refreshing itself, taking heat energy away with it. The result is that a spring house would be a cooler place to keep things, if not actually cold. But other than ice houses, which didn't really appear in the colonial landscape until the 18th century, this was the only place to keep things cool, but it had a very limited ability to do so. As a result, keeping pieces of raw meat around, unless frozen solid in winter, was not an option at all. So when cows were butchered, they were immediately cooked and either consumed, say, on a feast day or at a fete of some sort, or they were preserved in a variety of ways. The calves were usually kept whole, except for particular parts that had special uses, and adult cows, while sometimes roasted whole if they were smaller animals, they were more typically cut into quarters or cut into large pieces like haunches, shoulders, and roasts connected to ribs. The pieces of meat could range from hundreds of pounds for a whole spitted animal to quarters that could easily be 80 to 150 pounds, 40 to 70 kilos, or more family-sized portions that were still up around 10 or 20 pounds, that is 5 to 10 kilos. Given the equipment available, it was much more common to roast a large hunk of meat on a large stick, or later iron poles, for spit or trench roasting, and that's some early barbecue business, which we'll return to in the 18th century, or to double cook it as a large hunk. It was very typical to double cook meats at this time, first with a boil or a long simmer in a cauldron, and then some time on a spit roast. Then the meat was sliced for a grand presentation or cut into bite-sized chunks or gobbets to be served with vegetable sauces. These would be eaten by diners from trenchers or communal plates, or preserved in a variety of ways. And it wasn't just the lack of places to keep steaks or the lack of equipment for cooking steaks that made for this style of eating. It was also important to remember what utensils people typically used for eating in the 17th century. Forks existed, but they were pitchforks, and occasionally they were serving implements, but as personal eating tools in colonial America, not one bit. Sure, Catherine de' Medici was getting some serious side-eye for having one at table in 16th century France, and they were getting some play among the nobles and merchants in Italy. But for the typical 17th century eater, all over Europe and the Americas, the available utensils were spoons for soups, sauces, and stews, hands to tear off bits of bread to scoop up food, and a personal knife to cut off a reasonable bit to bite at. Also popular was the simple method of holding a larger piece in the hand and biting off pieces, hence the ever-popular turkey leg at the Disney parks and medieval times dinner theaters. When eating everything quickly in a big feast, or sharing cuts out to neighbors in a sort of meat credit swap wasn't an immediate option, there were a range of preservation methods. A common one used by the indigenous American inhabitants and colonists alike was to cut the cow up into smallish pieces and dry them over a low fire. Pieces that were lowest in fat made the best jerky. Sometimes they would be salted as well to keep longer, but fire drying over low and often purposely smoky fires for several days was the most typical as salt was scarce. Jerky was particularly appreciated since it could be eaten as is. While requiring some dedicated mastication, it was one of the few available high-protein fast foods or trail food items that was also fairly non-perishable. When portability was less important and more cooking equipment was available, pies and potting meat were very popular, and let's face it, much tastier. Chopped meat was often made into a pie with some onions, other vegetables, and herbs and salt as they were available. A strong encasing crust would hold everything while it was baking. At the end of that process, a broth mixture that contained a large amount of gelatin would be poured in. As the pie cooled, the gelatin would set, and this would keep all the meat and veg away from air, thus keeping the pies in good shape for several days, especially if they could be kept somewhere cool, say, in a spring house. Potted meats were typically cooked and pounded, sometimes with fruits, dried or fresh, and onions and spices as they were available. These highly flavored, pasty mixtures would be packed tightly into a pottery vessel. Then a layer of fat would be poured over the top to exclude air, and then a piece of leather or bladder would be tied over that as a second layer of protection. These potted meats could be used as a pie filling or to stuff other items like birds or other roasts. When they were used that way, they would typically be called farce. And yes, potted meats would definitely go in the cellar or the spring house to keep cool if you had one. If you wanted to save a larger chunk of meat for later, sometimes they were smoked and dried. This larger hunk of leathery, smoky meat would often have pieces sliced or hacked off, chopped fine, and added to soups and stews, as it needed to be reconstituted to be edible. But this method had limited storage time and tended to attract critters, varmints, bugs. It was rudimentary and abandoned as soon as better solutions were on hand. The most preferred method for keeping large pieces of beef was to pickle or salt them while they were still raw. This was only possible where fairly large supplies of salt were available. That meant salted meat wasn't common until later in the 17th century, when the salt trade to the colonies was figured out. But because salt was imported, it mostly had to be used for value-added products to work out economically. And this is where one of the first steadily successful money-making ventures of the North American British colonies came in. The salted meat could then be further kept preserved one of two ways. It could be hot smoked or cooked through slowly, as is still done with hams. But beef does not keep well this way and tends to become leathery rather than hammy. So the second way to keep salted meat is to shut it in an airtight barrel with the extremely salted juices that exude from the meat. This meat can keep reasonably this way for about a year. It needs to be soaked before it can be eaten, but it's not terrible. Unfortunately, because salt beef, if it remains airtight, will not actually spoil for years, but the beef itself continues to separate into solid protein matter and the cellular liquids. So notorious British Navy beef might be 5 or even 10 years old and be more similar to leather or even wet wood than actual food. This was definitely not a fail-safe method and could produce pretty good or rather horrid results based on skill, the quantity of salt, and time spent in the barrel. Outside of Caribbean sugar, fish from Newfoundland, Maine, and eventually Massachusetts were the first money-making British colonial food product. It was barrels of salted meat that were the second. The colonies had the necessary hardwood for barrel making and shipbuilding. They had the room to roam the cattle around and the ports to bring the salt in and ship the barrels of beef back out. So before cotton, before indigo, and before rice, the two most profitable exports of the southern colonies were tobacco and salt beef. That also meant most of the surplus cattle, the ones that were not explicitly involved in the 3 categories of working cows, were eaten elsewhere, on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and on Navy, merchant, fishing, and whaling ships. Which is how, if you were a 17th century British colonist in North America, you ate beef either never or almost never. But if it was calf killing time, or the family ox was not earning his feed, how did they turn up on the dinner trestle table? As I said before, calves were mostly roasted whole or quartered. They might also be simmered then roasted, and calves did contain some parts that were especially appreciated for help in other food prep. Calves' feet, and bones generally, were very rich in collagen, which is a protein in all connective tissue. Incidentally, this is why baby animals, including calves, are so flexible and wobbly. They often have collagen placeholders keeping things together that bones will fill in later. Now, in chemistry land, collagen is long protein helices that really love water. They like to stick to each other, and they tangle up with each other gently but firmly. When the collagen is boiled for a while, it unravels a bit and becomes gelatin. Liquids that contain gelatin, once they drop below about 90 degrees or 30 C, solidify to a bouncy, wiggly gel. The fact that gelatin mixtures melt right around body temperature is part of what gives them that unctuous tongue coating property. Higher concentrations of gelatin, mixtures that contain less water, have higher melting temperatures, all the way up to 100 degrees or 40 C, which makes the much-storied pocket soup possible, and what made the gelatin broths so useful for filling up and preserving meat pies. Because colonists had a very different relationship to fat and scarcity than the typically sedentary American currently does, there were some organs of calves highly valued due to their high fat and vitamin contents that we rarely think about anymore. These were sweetbreads or thymus glands, the fries or testes of male calves, and brains. Hearts, lungs, kidneys, and tripes or stomachs were also consumed in different ways. But there was one part of the calf that was the prize for the milk cow keeping colonist. This was the lining of the calf's fourth stomach. This is where rennet was found. Rennet is a complex set of enzymes needed for making milk turn into curds for cheeses that can be aged. I'll explain all of that much more in 2 episodes from now. That rennet lining was separated, dried, and then small pieces would be cut off to set cheese over the following year. So the annual calf was more than a set of tasty meat and stews and pies and broths and jellies. A calf also was a way to store milk and use milk throughout the year, again when there was almost no refrigeration. The superannuated ox or milk cow, now on the food side, they were just mostly meat. Some collagen was available, but nowhere near as much with the calf. The special edible parts were the cow brains, again a coveted source of fat, and the liver and the tongue. Unlike many other meats, these were a sensible size and were relatively tender and simple to preserve as a pickle, in gelatin, or as a potted meat. The other cow organ meats were eaten, but generally with less relish, or they were added to sausages. Cow organ recipes were much more part of the vernacular cooking and rarely made it into printed book recipe form. But cow blood sausages were important and popular, much as the black pudding lives on, even now in British cuisine. Unlike the calf, which was a cooking accessory bonanza, the non-meat parts of the cow were more of a general store. Cow hides were incredibly useful for shoes, boots, gloves, tool wrappings, bags, and straps. Cow suet, a particularly hard, clean fat from around their kidneys, was a substitute for wax. When rendered or purified, it would become tallow, which has a melting point of about 100 degrees or 40 C. Its very low water content made it especially resistant to turning rancid, so it was prized as a sealant for pots of food, or as an ingredient in long-keeping puddings, cakes, and pies. Think like fruit cake or mincemeat. It would also be used to make candles on occasion, but they tended to drip far more than higher quality beeswax ones. There is a great scene dealing with just this problem in the masterpiece miniseries Victoria. Later on, as books become more common, cowhide would work as book covers, and horns came in handy as drinking vessels, but were far more appreciated as sort of a pre-petroleum age plastic. Slices and sheets of horn were a flexible, moldable, cuttable, durable material that could be used to make things like buttons, spoons, pipe stems, or even thin sheets to work as windows or protect documents. The single-panel readers that children learned from in the 17th century that were referred to as horn books were a transparent sheet of horn that protected a piece of paper containing things like the alphabet or the Lord's Prayer or simple numbers and mathematics. Cow bones were useful as handles and other tools, but soon would also enter the agricultural rotation as fertilizer. We're not quite there yet, but that is coming up. To round out the 17th century cow usefulness tour, let's look at just who was eating what part of the cow. I mean, was tenderloin always all that in a bag of chips? In the 17th century, what were the best cow parts? When thinking of beef, the best and the worst, it is important to remember that the 21st century cow and the 17th century cow are physiologically and philosophically on opposite sides of the food galaxy. The 21st century cow is a food animal. period. And we invest some serious money into selecting, raising, and turning them into food. The 17th century cow, on the other hand, was either a valuable work animal that finished out its highly valuable life by adding desperately needed protein and fat to the table, or was a low investment way to convert wasteland into some cash. Either way, these cows were simply bred with what was available from a distance-limited selection, and they rarely got to wander about indolently and were absolutely never fattened up, except maybe on a few meadows of awesome spring herbs. Their flesh was typically much older and harder worked than the modern cow, so it was stringier and almost devoid of intramuscular fat. Yes, the rules were the same. The cuts of meats higher up and closer to the middle of the cow were going to be more tender, but the habit of cooking large pieces of cow all at once meant that most of the cuts, steaks, and roasts we think of now didn't really exist. The dream was a nice, sensible, boneless piece that could be depended on, not to be invaded by connective tissue. This meant, as I mentioned before, the incredibly convenient tongue was pretty universally loved. Tenderloin wasn't particularly known as it wasn't typically separated out from the rest of the cow quarter. Rather, the coveted meat was generally a slice of well-roasted ox sirloin, which includes the tenderloin, and meat from the short loin or rib roast were next on the list. Again, these are all portions coming from the top center of the cow. But because stew and pie made a lot of dinner lists, even the necks, breast, shin, and tail all were appreciated, both for the rich broths they made and for the shreds of meat they yielded. When it came to packing beef for sea, you can bet the enterprising packer would put the meaty cuts on top, in case any overzealous inspector got ideas, but all the bony gristly bits and sometimes even the hooves would be in there. So the top of a ship's hierarchy, captains and the mates, would get first dibs on the large meaty pieces, loins, ribs, and even the shoulders and rumps, while leg, shank, neck, belly, and tail cuts would go to the regular able seamen, deckhands, and the old tars. If the meat was particularly tough and leathery, these men would often take a chance and use their salt meat to attempt to catch fish, even sharks. So there's the roundup of which cows were food and how they were generally eaten. And I would like to quickly acknowledge a small victory. I have now touched on every symbol in my logo. While that metal cowboy-style coffee pot doesn't yet have anything in it, and that'll have to wait for next century, I have hit on beef, sugar, and iron. So next episode will be Milk Week, and I'll look at how drinking fresh, liquid milk was a pretty rare thing in the 17th century. But we will see what liquid milk products were part of 17th century food. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Remember, a few words to review this podcast really will make a difference. It's like voting in a midterm election. It will make this podcast easier for more people to find. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. And the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show's description.